letter arrived on a Wednesday, which Ilara Voss would later think was the most ordinary detail of the most extraordinary day of her life. Wednesdays were for grocery runs and accounting, and the kind of quiet that settles into a house when nothing is expected. She had been standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea going cold beside her, sorting through a small stack of mail, when she found it. It was addressed to her in her husband's handwriting, which was strange, because her husband was in the next room. She looked at the sealed envelope for a long moment. Her name was written carefully, deliberately, the way someone writes when they want to make sure the handwriting does not betray any emotion. She set the rest of the mail aside. She did not open it immediately. Something in the weight of that thin envelope told her that the world on the other side of its seal was going to be different from the world on this side, and she was not quite ready to cross over. Duke Hadrian Caldermere was 41 years old and had the kind of face that looked good in portraits. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never truly worried about money or social standing. He had been, for most of their 7-year marriage, a courteous husband. Not warm, not affectionate, but courteous. He remembered her birthday. He appeared at the required public events. He spoke well of her to others when she was not in the room, which she knew because people told her so with the slightly uncomfortable brightness of people delivering faint praise. He was not a bad man, she had always told herself. He was simply a man who had married the right woman for the wrong reasons and had eventually grown tired of pretending otherwise. Ilara had understood all of this for at least 3 of their 7 years. She had simply chosen, as many women in her position chose, to manage the gap between the marriage she had and the marriage she had hoped for. She managed it with work, with the quiet satisfaction of running a large household well, with her friendships, with her translation work, which she did privately because Hadrian found it mildly embarrassing that she worked at all. She managed it, and she was, if not happy, then at least not unhappy. At least that was what she told herself. She had become rather skilled at telling herself things. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She had found out 4 days ago. She had spent those 4 days turning the information over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its shape, its weight, deciding what you will do with it. She had felt, underneath all the uncertainty, a deep and quiet joy. She had wanted children for years. Hadrian had been vague on the subject, which she had interpreted as eventual agreement, and which she now suspected had been deliberate evasion. But she was pregnant now, and she had decided to tell him that evening, and she had been almost looking forward to it, because she had hoped, perhaps naively, that it might change things, that it might open something up between them. She opened the envelope. It was 2 pages, handwritten, which surprised her. She had expected something typed, something lawyerly, something delivered through a third party. Instead, it was his hand, his careful and controlled handwriting, 2 full pages of it. She stood at the kitchen counter and read it all the way through without stopping, and then she put it down and picked up her tea and drank some of it even though it was cold, because she needed something to do with her hands. He was ending the marriage. He did not use those words. He said that he had been doing a great deal of reflection, and that he had come to believe that they had grown apart in fundamental ways, and that he did not think it was fair to either of them to continue. He said that he hoped she would understand that this was not about any failure on her part. He said that he had already spoken to his solicitor, and that he believed the process could be handled with minimal difficulty if both parties were cooperative. He said that he hoped they could remain respectful toward one another. He did not mention love, which was perhaps the most honest thing about the letter. She read it again. Then she folded it neatly along its original creases and set it on the counter beside her cold tea. She noticed that her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. She noticed that she felt, above everything else, a strange and terrible clarity, the kind that comes when something you have half known for a long time is finally said aloud, and you realize you have already been grieving it without knowing you were. She walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway and knocked on the door of his study, which was the room he always retreated to when he did not want to have a conversation. The door opened on the second knock. He was standing just inside the doorway as if he had been waiting there, which he probably had been. He looked, she thought, like a man who had already rehearsed the next 15 minutes many times and was now waiting for the performance to begin. "I read it," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard you knock around." He paused. "I thought it was better in writing. Easier to get everything said properly." She looked at him. She had known his face for 7 years. She knew the small scar above his left eyebrow from a riding accident when he was 12. She knew the way he pressed his thumb against his index finger when he was nervous. He was doing it now. "Is there someone else?" she asked. A different man might have looked away. Hadrian looked directly at her, which she had always respected about him even when everything else was complicated. "Yes," he said. "How long?" 8 months. 8 months. She counted backwards without meaning to. 8 months ago, they had attended a foundation dinner at the Whitmore Hotel, and she had worn the blue dress he had said was his favorite, and they had danced once, and she had thought it was a good evening. She filed that away somewhere inside herself and did not look at it again. "Who is she?" Alara asked. He told her. Celeste Miro. She recognized the name, but only vaguely, as one recognizes a name read briefly in a society column and not retained. Young, she assumed. She was right. "She is 22, Hadrian said. Alara nodded slowly. "And you want to marry her?" "Eventually," he said, which was either honesty or tactlessness, and she suspected was both. She stood in the hallway outside his study door and thought about telling him. She had been pregnant for 6 weeks, and she had been planning to tell him this evening, and she had imagined the conversation going in a completely different direction. She thought about what it would mean to tell him now, in this doorway, with the letter still folded on the kitchen counter. She thought about what he would do with that information. She thought about whether she wanted his response to her pregnancy to come from obligation rather than desire. She decided, standing in that hallway, that she did not. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right? I will speak to my solicitor," she said. "If you have already spoken to yours, then we should each have representation." He had clearly expected more. A scene, tears, or anger, or both. She could see the readjustment happening behind his eyes, the slight recalibration of a man who had prepared for one conversation and was now in a different one. "Of course," he said carefully. "Yes, that is the sensible way to handle it." "Good," she said. She turned and walked back down the hallway. She did not slam any doors. She did not break anything. She went back to the kitchen, poured her cold tea down the drain, and made a fresh cup. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the warm mug, and breathed in and breathed out, and thought about what she was going to do next. She did not cry until much later, alone in the room she had moved to quietly over the past 2 years when Hadrian's work habits had made sharing a bedroom impractical, as they had both agreed without ever really discussing it. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed her hand flat against her stomach and cried, not for the marriage, because she thought she had already done most of that grieving in advance without knowing it, but for the version of this moment she had imagined, the one where she told him, and he was glad. The one where they sat together and talked about names and the future, and something shifted between them in a way that made the previous years feel worth it. She cried for that imagined moment, which had never existed and now never would. Then she stopped, because she was not by nature a person who allowed herself extended grief when there was thinking to be done. Nell Hartley appeared in the doorway. She was 53 years old, had been Alara's lady's maid since before the marriage, and had the particular gift of being exactly present when needed, and entirely invisible when not. She did not say anything. She simply sat down in the chair near the window, because sitting in the chair near the window was what she did when something difficult had happened and she was waiting to be useful. "He has been seeing someone for 8 months, Alara said, not looking at her. "I know," Nell said. Alara looked at her then. "You knew." "I suspected," Nell said. "I did not know how to tell you, and then I thought perhaps you already knew." "I did not know." "No," Nell said quietly. "I can see that." They sat in the room together for a while, not talking, which was one of the things Alara valued most about Nell. She did not fill silences with noise out of discomfort. She allowed things to be what they were. "He wants a divorce," Alara said, "or an annulment, whichever his solicitor recommends." "And what do you want?" Nell asked. Alara thought about that for a long time. What she wanted was complicated and contradictory, and would take time to sort out. What she knew, in this moment, was what she did not want. She did not want a public confrontation. She did not want to fight through the papers while everyone with an opinion about the Caldermere marriage watched from a comfortable distance. She did not want Hadrian to know about the pregnancy yet, because she needed to think clearly, and she could not think clearly while also managing his reaction to information this significant. She needed time. She needed space. She needed, more than anything, to be somewhere that was not this house. She had a great-aunt named Dorothea who had left her a small amount of money in a will that had been settled the previous year. Alara had not touched it. It sat in an account she had opened separately from their joint finances, which she had done more out of habit than intent. The habit of a woman who had always understood that complete dependence on another person was a vulnerability she preferred not to carry. The money was not large enough to be impressive and was large enough to be useful, which was, she had always thought, the best kind of money. She could go somewhere quiet and not known. She could have the children, plural, because she had also not mentioned to Hadrian that the physician had told her she was carrying 3, and she could think about what came next without anyone watching her think about it. "I need to leave," she said. Nell did not look surprised. "Where?" The coast, somewhere, south. I will find something. When? Soon, Ilara said. Before the paperwork progresses far enough that I cannot go without it seeming like flight. Nell nodded. I will start looking tomorrow. Ilara looked at her. You do not have to come. I cannot pay you at first, not properly. I am aware, Nell said in the tone of someone who finds a certain class of statement mildly insulting. I will look tomorrow. They did not discuss it further. Ilara lay down on top of her bed covers still in her clothes, because changing into something comfortable felt like too much effort, and she stared at the ceiling of the room she had always found too formal and too cold, and she thought about 3 small heartbeats, which the physician had confirmed were all strong and regular, and she held that thought the way she had held the warm tea mug, for its steadiness, for its solidity against everything that was shifting underneath her. Outside in the house, she heard Hadrian's study door open and his footsteps on the stairs. She heard him move down the hallway. She heard him stop outside her door for a moment, a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then continue past it. She lay very still and listened to him go. She had 7 years of memories in this house, the early ones, the ones from when she had still believed they might make something real together, those she kept. The later ones, the carefully maintained politeness, the dinners with an agenda and conversations with a time limit, the evenings where they sat in the same room reading separate books and called it companionship, those she let go of quietly in the dark. She had a job to do now. She had always been better with a clear task than with open grief. She would find a way through. She always had. The next morning she rose early, before the house was awake, and went to the kitchen and made a proper breakfast for the first time in months, because she was now eating for 4 and she was not about to let sentiment interfere with nutrition. She sat at the kitchen table alone in the early light and ate methodically and thought carefully and began, quietly and without drama, to plan. She did not know yet exactly how the next years would go. She did not know about the court battle or the legal ruling, or the letter from the solicitor that would find her 8 years later in the coastal cottage she had come to love more than any house she had ever lived in. She did not know about the Tuesday morning when everything that had been withheld would arrive at her garden gate in the form of 3 boys carrying fishing nets. What she knew, sitting in her kitchen in the early morning of the day after her world changed, was that she was 34 years old and capable and not alone in the way that mattered most, and that whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. That was enough to start with. That, and the warm light coming through the kitchen window, and the quiet certainty of 3 small lives she had already decided to protect with everything she had. She finished her breakfast, washed the plate, and went to find Nell. Nell Hartley had worked for the Voss family since she was 27 years old, which meant she had known Ilara since Ilara was 11, and she had watched her grow from a serious, thoughtful girl into a serious, thoughtful woman, with the kind of spine that only shows itself when something tries to break it. She had watched Ilara marry Duke Hadrian Caldermere with a composed expression, and careful eyes, and the look of a person who had made a practical decision, and was fully aware of its nature. She had watched the marriage settle into its particular shape over 7 years, and she had worried, quietly, on many evenings in her small room at the back of the house. She had seen Celeste Miro 3 times without knowing who she was, once at the Whitmore Hotel dinner, once at a charity auction, and once through the window of a car outside a restaurant that Hadrian had gone to alone on a Tuesday in March. She had seen the way his face changed when he thought no one was watching, which was the way a man's face changes when he is where he wants to be, and she had stored the information away and turned it over, and eventually arrived at a conclusion she had not wanted to reach. She had not told Ilara, and she was not entirely at peace with that decision, but she had told herself that a thing unconfirmed is not a thing known, and that arriving at Ilara with a suspicion rather than a certainty would only cause pain without providing the grounding that came with actual knowledge. She had been wrong about that. She knew it now. The cottage she found was in Port Haven, a small town on the southern coast that most people in their social world had never heard of, which was exactly why she had chosen it. It was a 40-minute walk from the nearest train station, which was itself not a station that anyone traveled to for any purpose other than practical necessity. The cottage had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen garden that needed work, a view of the water from the upstairs window, and a landlord named Jeffrey Marsh, who was 70 years old, hard of hearing, and entirely uninterested in the personal lives of his tenants. It was available immediately and the rent was reasonable. Nell paid the first month from her own savings and told Ilara only that she had found somewhere suitable. They left on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the letter. They took Ilara's car, which was in her own name because she had bought it before the marriage and had never transferred the registration. They took 2 suitcases each and a box of books and the small framed photograph of Ilara's mother that had sat on the windowsill of every room Ilara had occupied for as long as Nell could remember. They left in the morning before the household staff arrived, because Alara did not want to answer questions or receive expressions of sympathy that would cost her composure at the wrong moment. Hadrian did not come out to see them go. Alara had told him, the evening before, that she was going to spend time with family while the legal matters were sorted. She had not specified which family or where, and he had not asked, and she had thought, watching his face carefully for any sign of something real, that he was perhaps relieved, that the departure of someone you have wronged relieves you of the daily evidence of what you have done. She did not say this to him. She said, "I will have my solicitor in touch with yours," and he nodded, and that was the last meaningful thing they said to each other in that house. She did look back once. As the car reached the end of the long drive, she looked back at the stone facade and the tall windows and the formal garden that she had redesigned 3 years into the marriage, because the previous layout had been graceless, and she thought that it was a beautiful house and that she had never fully loved it. She faced forward again and did not look back a second time. The drive took just over 4 hours. Alara drove the first 2 and Nell drove the last 2, because Alara had fallen asleep somewhere along the motorway with her head resting against the passenger window, and Nell had seen no reason to wake her. Sleep, in Nell's estimation, was a form of wisdom. The body knew when to rest, and a woman who was 12 weeks pregnant with triplets and navigating the dissolution of a 7-year marriage had a great many legitimate claims on unconsciousness. The cottage was smaller than Alara had expected, which she said with a tone that was not criticism, and Nell received as the closest thing to approval she was likely to get. It smelled of salt and old wood, and a faint trace of the lavender that someone had planted in the window boxes and not maintained. The kitchen was narrow but had good light. The largest bedroom had a view of the water, which Alara claimed immediately, not because she had any interest in claiming things, but because the view was genuinely good, and she was pragmatic about comfort when comfort cost nothing extra. They unpacked in the afternoon. It did not take long because they had not brought much, which was something Alara had done deliberately, and which Nell understood was also a statement about what she was leaving behind, and what she was bringing forward. Alara stood in the kitchen that evening making soup from what they had stopped to buy on the way, and Nell sat at the small kitchen table watching her, and neither of them said much, because neither of them needed to. Outside the window the sea was doing what the sea does, moving constantly and entirely without regard for anyone's circumstances, which Alara found, to her surprise, comforting. "No one knows we are here," Alara said. "No one I spoke to," Nell confirmed. "I used my name for the rental. Your name is not on anything." "Good." Alara stirred the soup. "I need time to think before I decide what to tell people." "What will you tell people eventually?" "The truth," Alara said. "Eventually. But in my own time and in my own way." Nell nodded. There were a few people who would have to be told. Alara's brother, Owen, who was kind and would take it badly on her behalf. Her friend Constance Lee, who was sharp and would immediately want to do something about it. And the physician, who was already managing the pregnancy and would need to continue. Those were the necessary people. Beyond them, the world could wait. The soup was good. They ate it at the small kitchen table and listened to the sound of the sea and the wind, and Nell thought that this small cottage on the edge of everything was exactly the right place for what came next. Not grand and not frightening and not watching, just a place where something could grow in quiet. "The physician said all 3 are healthy," Alara said, not looking up from her bowl. "I know," Nell said. "You told me." "I keep saying it to make it feel real." A pause. 3. "I keep trying to make that number make sense in my head." Nell smiled, which she allowed herself when Alara was not going to see it. "It will make sense eventually. Usually around the point when they are all making noise at the same time." Alara looked up at that, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, but it was real, and it did something important to the air in the small kitchen, and Nell noted it, and was glad. What Alara did not yet know was that the annulment papers Hadrian had filed contained an error, a small but significant error in the stated dates of separation, entered by his solicitor's junior associate who had been given too many files and too little time. The error meant that the legal timeline of the marriage dissolution was, on paper, slightly different from the actual timeline, which would matter considerably when, 8 years later, the question of the children's legal status was examined in detail. She would not discover this for years. When she did, her own solicitor would describe it as extraordinarily fortunate, and she would think of it as the universe making a small correction for a large injustice, which was perhaps the same thing. She did not know about the error that Thursday evening in the kitchen. She only knew that the soup was warm and the wind was loud, and she was somewhere no one was looking at her, which was its own form of relief. Owen arrived 11 days later. She had called him from the cottage the morning after they arrived. because Owen was not someone she could leave in uncertainty, and she trusted him completely. He arrived by train, took a taxi from the station, and stood in the doorway of the cottage with a look on his face that combined distress, anger on her behalf, and the particular helplessness of a person who wants to fix something that is not fixable. Owen Voss was 38 years old, 2 years younger than Alara, and had their father's quietness and their mother's directness, and the result of this combination was a person who said little and meant everything he said. He came in without speaking, sat at the kitchen table, accepted the tea Nell gave him, and looked at his sister. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am going to be," she said. "That is not the same thing as all right." "No," she agreed. "But it is what I have for now." He nodded. He was that kind of person. He accepted the answer he was given and worked with it rather than pushing for the one he wanted. She told him about the pregnancy. She told him about the triplets. She watched his face go through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which he tried to hide from her. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers and did not say anything for a long moment. "Does he know?" Owen asked. "No. Ilara. I know," she said. "I have thought about it carefully. I am not telling him until I am ready. There are things I need to understand first. Legal things, rights, what it means for the children and for me if they know from the beginning, versus if the information becomes available at a moment of my choosing." Owen looked at her steadily. "You are going to use it," he said, "not as an accusation." "I am going to protect it," she said. "Which is different. I am going to protect the fact of these 3 children and their place in the world. And I am going to do that by not handing information to someone who has already shown me that he does not handle important things carefully." Owen was quiet for a while. The sea was loud today, louder than it had been the previous evenings, and the sound of it came through the walls of the cottage in a constant low presence. "I want to do something," he said finally. "You can help me find a solicitor," she said. "A good one, not connected to anyone in Hadrian's circle." "I know someone," Owen said. "Her name is Rosalind Frey. She is based in the city, but she takes cases in other counties. She is very good, and she does not get flustered." "That is what I need," Ilara said. Someone who does not get flustered. Rosalind Frey turned out to be 45 years old, with short silver-streaked hair, and the particular calm of a person who had sat across from a great many people in difficult situations, and had never yet been surprised by human behavior. She drove to Porthaven the following week and sat in the cottage's small sitting room with a notepad on her knee, and listened to Ilara tell the entire story from the beginning, without interrupting once. When Ilara finished, Rosalind Frey wrote 3 lines on her notepad, capped her pen, and said, "Right. Here is what we are going to do." Ilara liked her immediately. The legal plan was careful and unhurried. Rosalind's view was that there was no advantage in moving quickly on Ilara's side. Hadrian's solicitor was pushing for a fast resolution, which in Rosalind's experience meant that Hadrian's side had something they wanted that quick completion would secure. The longer the process ran, the more it would become clear what that something was. In the meantime, Ilara's job was to stay private, stay healthy, and let the pregnancy proceed without Hadrian's interference. The question of whether and when to disclose the children was the most significant decision Ilara faced, and Rosalind laid out the landscape with a precision that Ilara found genuinely useful. In terms of legal rights, the children born within or shortly after a legal marriage, and the annulment was not yet complete, which Hadrian's solicitor appeared to be in some haste to correct, would carry a presumption of legitimacy that would be very difficult to challenge. The Caldermere dukedom, being one of the oldest in the country with an entailed title and estate that passed only through legitimate male heirs, was an institution that the law took seriously. If the children were boys and if their birth fell within the legal marriage timeline, their claim to the title was something no amount of mutual inconvenience could simply set aside. "You are saying," Ilara said carefully, "that if I have sons, they have a legitimate claim to his title and his estate." "I am saying that the law would think so," Rosalind said. "Regardless of the state of the marriage, regardless of what he wants, regardless of who he marries afterward." The room was very quiet for a moment. "I do not want his title," Ilara said. "I know," Rosalind said. "That is not what this is about. I want my children to be safe," Ilara said. "I want them to have what they are entitled to. I want them not to be hidden away or denied or treated as inconvenient. That is all." "That," Rosalind said, picking up her pen again, "is exactly what the law is designed to protect." Ilara went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the sea, and thought about the 3 small people growing in the quiet dark of her body, entirely unaware of the world they were being born into. entirely unaware that their existence was already a fact of enormous consequence that was being carefully managed by two women in a cottage on the southern coast. She pressed her hand against her stomach, which was only just beginning to show, and she told them, in her head, that she was going to manage it well, that she was careful and not easily frightened, and more stubborn than most people suspected from looking at her, that they were going to be all right. Then, she turned over and went to sleep. Nell was in the kitchen in the morning, which she always was, and the sea was doing its thing outside, and the lavender in the window boxes, which Alara had watered every day since arriving, was beginning to look less ragged. Small things. But small things had always been how Alara Voss kept her footing, one manageable thing at a time, in order, without looking too far ahead. The next day she enrolled herself with the local physician under her maiden name, arranged a midwife consultation for the following month, and sat down at the kitchen table with her translation work, which a small legal firm in the city had continued to send her by post without any questions about her change of address. She translated legal documents from German and French into English. She was very good at it. She had always been better at other people's language than at her own feelings, which was perhaps not the most balanced way to be, but was proving useful under current circumstances. She worked for 4 hours. She made lunch. She went for a walk along the coastal path until the cold made her cheeks sting and her breath come in small visible clouds. She came home and made tea and sat with Nell and listened to the sea. It was not what she had planned her life to be. But it was, she was beginning to think, a life she could make something of. That would have to be enough. And for now, with the pale winter sun coming through the window, and the sound of the waves outside, and the certain knowledge of 3 heartbeats she carried with her everywhere, it was. The boys were born on a February night when the wind off the sea was loud enough to rattle the cottage windows, and the sky over the water was the color of iron. It was the kind of night that made you feel the world was doing something significant, which, in the cottage on Port Haven's western edge, it was. Marcus came first, at 11 minutes past midnight, which Nell recorded in the small notebook she had decided to keep for exactly this purpose. Aldrich came 7 minutes later. Cale arrived at 22 minutes past, and the midwife, a steady woman named Patricia Webb who had delivered more children in this county than she had ever bothered to count, set him in Alara's arms and said quietly, 3 boys, all healthy, all lungs working properly, which was how Patricia Webb announced things when she was most pleased about them. Alara held all 3 of them in sequence, because the midwife was practical and rotation was manageable, and she looked at each face in the dim light of the bedroom, and felt something happen inside her that she did not have words for, and did not try to name. It was not the version of this she had imagined, in the house at Caldermere with the right man present and the right circumstances surrounding it. It was a cottage in a windstorm in February, with only Nell and Patricia for company. But the boys were real, and their eyes, when they opened, were dark and searching, and they turned toward her voice when she spoke, which Patricia said was normal and which felt, to Alara, like a promise being made in the oldest possible language. Nell cried, which she did in her characteristic way, briefly, and with complete composure, and without any acknowledgement that it was happening. She wrote the names in the notebook in her careful handwriting. Marcus Owen Voss, Aldrich George Voss, Cale Edward Voss. The middle names were for her brother Owen and for her father, who had died when she was 22, and whom she still missed with a clean, steady grief that had long since stopped being sharp and become simply a part of her. She did not give them Hadrian's name. She had thought about this carefully, and she had made the decision without ambivalence. Their surname was Voss. They were hers. If the world eventually had something to say about their other name and their other inheritance, that conversation would happen in its own time and at her direction. But their first identity in the world would be her name, her choice, her family. She sent a letter to Owen that morning, 3 sentences. He called her that afternoon from a telephone box in town because he did not want the call tracked to his home line, which was perhaps excessive caution, but which Alara appreciated as a gesture of solidarity. He said, 3 boys, in a voice that came in 2 separate attempts, the first one not quite making it all the way through. 3 boys, she confirmed. Are you all right? I am better than all right, she said. I am tired, and I ache everywhere, and I could sleep for a week, and I am better than all right. She heard him breathe. Tell them, he said, meaning he would be one of their people from a distance, reliably, without needing to be present to prove it, which was the kind of thing Owen did not say directly, but which Alara heard anyway. The first weeks were ferocious. Patricia Webb came daily for the first 10 days and then every 3 days for the following 2 weeks, and Nell ran the house with the precise efficiency of a person who had decided that sentiment was fine, but logistics were what actually kept 3 newborns alive and well. They worked in shifts without formally calling them shifts. Nell slept from 10 in the evening until 2 in the morning, and Alara slept from 2 until 6, and through the day they traded off in an unspoken rhythm that developed naturally around the boys' schedules, which were loud and demanding, and entirely indifferent to the adults' need for consecutive hours of rest. Jeffrey Marsh, the landlord, appeared one morning with a large pot of something his wife had made, a thick stew that smelled of carrots and bay leaf. He left it on the doorstep and knocked and went away before anyone answered, which was exactly the right way to manage that particular gesture, and Alara noted it with appreciation. The neighbors on the left, a couple named the Caldwells, sent a card with no names inside it, just a small drawing of 3 birds, which either meant they had figured out the general situation or were simply eccentric. Either way, Alara kept the card. She went back to her translation work at 6 weeks, because the money was necessary and because the work was hers, a thing that existed independently of everything else that had happened, a small proof of her own competence and continuity, that she needed like she needed the coastal walks she resumed with the boys, in an arrangement of carriers that Nell had researched with the seriousness she applied to all important projects. They walked every day that the weather allowed, which in Port Haven meant most days if you were not afraid of wind, and Alara was not. The path along the coastal edge gave her a view of the water and the salt-sharpened air, and the particular quality of light over the sea that was different from any light she had known before. Clear and bright, and somehow always a little larger than anything inland. She walked and thought and breathed and arrived home calmer than she had left. The boys slept in the carriers, which was one of the fundamental pleasures of their early months, and one she was aware she should not rely on indefinitely. At the Caldermere estate, which was several counties away and might as well have been another world, Hadrian and Celeste had married in May. Alara knew because Owen told her, and Owen knew because it had been in 3 separate publications and he had felt it was better she hear it from him than encounter it unexpectedly. She had been sitting at the kitchen table nursing Cale when Owen told her, and she had taken the information in and sat with it for a moment, and then looked down at the small, determined face of her youngest son, and felt something settle in her that she could not have named precisely, but that felt like resolution. She was done with that chapter. It was closed. What was ahead was what mattered. She did not, however, stop paying attention. Paying attention had always been one of her particular skills, the kind that runs quietly beneath a composed exterior and absorbs detail without seeming to try. She read what was published about the Caldermere family with the detached interest of someone following a story that once involved them but no longer does. She watched the social coverage of Hadrian's new marriage, the charity events, the estate photographs, the careful management of public image that she recognized from the inside, and which looked, from the outside, entirely convincing. She noticed, without triumph or satisfaction, that Celeste was good at exactly the things Alara had been good at, which was to say the performance of happiness in public and the maintenance of required appearances. She wished her neither well nor ill. She simply did not wish. What she did, instead, was build. She built a life in the cottage with the same attention and care she had once applied to running a great household, except that this was better because it was entirely hers. She arranged the boys' room with the same eye for proportion and light that she had brought to the rooms at Caldermere, because she was who she was regardless of the size of the house. She kept the kitchen garden until it was producing herbs and 3 kinds of lettuce and the tomatoes that she grew against the south-facing wall through summer, and which were, she felt, the finest achievement of her time in Port Haven. She continued her translation work and took on additional clients and, in the 2nd year, began translating for a law firm in the city whose lead partner, a woman named Barbara Trent, became first a professional contact and then, cautiously, a friend. Barbara Trent was 51 years old, had been practicing law for 26 years, and had 3 adult children and a strong opinion about everything, which she delivered in a precise and direct manner that some people found intimidating, and Alara found restful. They began by exchanging work correspondence. They progressed to occasional telephone conversations. By the boy's 2nd birthday, Barbara was someone Alara spoke to regularly about things that were not work, which was a limited category in Alara's life but a significant one. It was Barbara who, entirely by accident, gave Alara the first piece of information that would eventually matter enormously. Barbara was talking about a case she was following with professional interest, involving the succession of a minor earldom in the Midlands and the question of legitimacy of children born within a marriage that was later annulled. She was talking about it as lawyers talk about interesting cases, with attention to precedent and principle, and Alara was listening with attention to something underneath the legal structure. The annulment timing matters enormously, Barbara said. The children's status depends on where the law considers the marriage to have existed when they were conceived. An annulment declared after conception does not retroactively illegitimate the children. The law does not work backwards that cleanly. Even if the marriage is formally annulled before the children are born? Alara asked, keeping her voice very neutral. Depends on the jurisdiction and the grounds, Barbara said. But generally, if the marriage was valid at the point of conception, the children carry that legitimacy regardless of what happens to the marriage afterward. A man cannot retroactively unmake his family simply by remarrying. Alara was quiet for a moment. That is interesting, she said. Well, law often is, Barbara said, and moved on to something else. Alara went to find Rosalind Frey the following week. The meeting was long and detailed and resulted in Rosalind pulling out several large volumes and making a number of notes in her careful hand, and arriving at the conclusion that the picture was, as she put it, very interesting indeed. The annulment had been finalized, but the grounds on which it had been granted and the timeline that had been submitted had a small irregularity. Rosalind had noticed it 2 years earlier and had flagged it internally without acting on it, because at the time there had been nothing to act on. Now there was something to consider. The boys were 2 years old. They were robust and loud and walked everywhere and had opinions about everything, which Alara managed with a consistency and patience that Patricia Webb, who still visited occasionally, described as remarkable, and which Alara described as necessary. Marcus was the one who walked first, who talked first, who always pushed to the front of any situation, not out of aggression but out of sheer forward momentum. Aldrich was quieter, more watchful, with a gift for stillness that Alara recognized as her own, and which she found both familiar and extraordinary in something so small. Cale was the one who laughed first and loudest at everything, who found the world a source of continuous entertainment and who, if you sat still long enough, would come and arrange himself against you like a small warm certainty. She loved them with a fierceness that still surprised her, 2 years in. She had always thought of herself as someone who managed her feelings carefully, who kept them at a considered distance and did not allow them to govern her decisions. These three had walked through that carefully maintained distance as if it were made of paper. She did not mind. She had not known, before them, what it felt like to love something that was entirely and simply good in the world. She told Rosalind, at the end of the legal meeting, "I am not going to do anything with this yet. I am going to wait." "You have time," Rosalind agreed. "The legal situation is not going anywhere. I want them to be older. I want to make sure they are settled and strong, and that whatever happens when this comes out, they have enough foundation to stand on." Rosalind looked at her steadily. "When it comes out, not if." "When," Alara said. "I have always known it would come out eventually. The Caldermere line is not the kind of thing that disappears quietly. At some point, someone is going to notice the absence of heirs and start looking. And at that point I want to be ready. I want to be the one who controls how the story is told." Rosalind made a small sound of professional appreciation. "You have thought about this for a while." "I have thought about little else for 2 years," Alara said, which was not entirely true but was close enough. She drove back to Port Haven in the afternoon light. The boys were with Nell, who had presumably established some form of managed chaos in the cottage in her absence. She stopped the car at the top of the coastal path, where there was a place you could pull over and look at the water, and she sat for a while with the engine off. The sea was doing what the sea does. The light on the water was that particular late afternoon gold that you could not describe to anyone who had not seen it, and which, once seen, was a reason to stay. She sat and breathed and thought about her 3 boys, and the carefully maintained secret of their existence, and the enormity of what they would one day be asked to carry, and whether she was doing this right. She did not know if she was doing it right. She was doing what made sense to her with the information she had and the values she held, and she was being as careful as she knew how to be. That was all anyone could do. She had learned that in the first 2 years. She drove home. The cottage windows were lit. Through the front window she could see the silhouette of Nell, small and upright, moving between the kitchen and the sitting room. The sound of the boys came through the walls before she had even opened the car door. She sat for one more moment in the quiet of the car, and then she got out and went inside. The warmth of the cottage met her at the door. 3 small faces turned toward her sound and her voice, as they had turned toward her voice on the night of the iron sky, and she thought, as she thought every evening she came home to this, that this was the truest thing in her life. Everything else was manageable. Everything else was simply what she was working through. This was the part that mattered. The years passed in the way that years pass when you are busy, without ceremony and faster than you expect. The boys turned 3, and then 4, and then 5, and each year they became more themselves, which was one of the things about children that Alara had not fully understood before she had them. They did not arrive as blank surfaces waiting to be shaped. They arrived with themselves already inside them, pushing steadily outward, and your job as a parent was less to make them into something, and more to make enough room for them to become what they already were. Marcus became what he had been from his first minutes, the one who moved forward. By 5 he had organized the other two into a system of neighborhood exploration that covered a radius Alara found alarming and which Nell monitored with a calm she did not entirely feel. He made friends with the ease of someone who had never considered the possibility of not making friends. He had his father's jaw and his mother's gray eyes and her stubbornness and her particular way of looking at something until he understood it, which in a 5-year-old looked a great deal like determination, and in a 40-year-old looked like leadership, and in the interim was mostly exhausting. Aldrich remained the watcher. He was the one who sat at the edge of the tide and observed the behavior of shorebirds with a patience that Patricia Webb, who came to visit once a year, now more from affection than medical necessity, called extraordinary. He did not talk much, but when he did, what he said was always precise and frequently unexpected. He was the one who, at age 5, asked Alara who his father was, not with accusation or distress, with the calm of someone asking a question they had been holding for some time, and had decided it was now appropriate to raise. She had prepared for this. She had been preparing for it since they were old enough to understand sentences. She sat with Aldrich on the bench in the kitchen garden, among the herbs she had spent 4 years cultivating into something she was genuinely proud of, and she told him the truth in the form appropriate for a 5-year-old. She told him that his father was a man she had been married to, that the marriage had ended before the boys were born, and that the man did not know about them yet. She told him that she intended to tell him eventually, and that when that happened, it would be a very big moment, and that she was managing when it happened very carefully because she wanted to get it right. Aldrich listened to all of this with his characteristic stillness. When she was done, he said, "Does he know about Marcus and Cale?" "No," she said. "He does not know about any of you yet. Will he be sad that he missed us being small?" She looked at her quiet, precise second son and thought about what an honest answer to that question looked like. "I think," she said carefully, "that there will be a lot of things he feels when he finds out. I cannot tell you exactly which ones." Aldrich nodded. He thought about this for a while. "Are you going to tell Marcus and Cale?" "When the time is right, yes." "Should I not say anything until then?" "Could you manage that?" she asked, genuinely curious, because keeping a secret among 3 8-year-old boys, or 5-year-old boys, out, felt like asking the tide not to move. "I can manage it," Aldrich said, with the confidence of someone who had already been thinking about whether he could. She told Marcus and Cale 2 weeks later, after a great deal of thought about timing and framing. She sat them down after dinner, which was when the kitchen was warm, and the day was winding down, and they were at their most settled. She told them what she had told Aldrich, adjusted only slightly for the different temperaments she was addressing. Marcus went very quiet, which was unusual for him, and which she watched carefully. Cale's face moved through about 6 expressions in 30 seconds before landing on something that looked like determined acceptance. Marcus said, after a long silence, "So we have a father." "You have a biological father," she said. "Whether or not he becomes more than that is something that will be worked out later. What you have right now is me and Nell and your Uncle Owen and your lives here, and those things are real and solid and not going anywhere." Marcus looked at her. He had the look of a person receiving information and checking it for accuracy, which she recognized because she did the same thing. "Will he take us somewhere?" he asked, and in his voice she heard, underneath the question, what he was actually asking, which was whether the life he had was secure or contingent. "No," she said, and she was as certain as she had ever been about anything. "Nobody is taking you anywhere you do not want to go. I promise you that." She watched all 3 of them process it. It was not a simple thing to hand a child, she knew that. But she also knew that the alternative, waiting until they were older or until the situation forced her hand, would have been worse. They deserved to know. They deserved to hear it from her, in a warm kitchen, with time to ask questions. Cale asked if the father was rich. She said yes. He thought about this and then said, "Is that why we do not have a television?" Which made Nell, who was standing in the doorway with a dish towel, make a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. It broke something in the room, very slightly, in the right direction, and Alara was grateful for it. The boys carried the knowledge the way children carry things, initially with great visible weight and then, progressively, with the casualness of something integrated. They did not talk about it constantly. They did not seem damaged by it. They asked occasional questions over the following months, practical and sometimes startling questions that Alara answered as honestly as she could without providing more than was useful for a child their age. Marcus wanted to know if the man had other children. She said not as far as she knew. Aldrich wanted to know if the man was kind. She thought about that one for a long time before answering. She said that kindness was complicated, and that she was not sure she was the right person to answer that particular question. Cale wanted to know if the man looked like them. She looked at Cale's face, which was so strongly Hadrian's in its structure that anyone who had known Hadrian would have known immediately, and she said, "Yes, quite a lot." The boys started school in Porthaven at the age of 5, which was the nearest school and the obvious choice, and which turned out to be exactly right for them. Their teacher, a cheerful woman named Grace Hollis, who had been teaching in Porthaven for 15 years and was not easily surprised by anything, told Ilara at the first parent meeting that she had never taught triplets before, and that she was finding it entirely educational. Marcus was already organizing the reading corner. Aldrich was helping the slower readers with a seriousness Grace found both touching and slightly unnerving in a 5-year-old. Cale had made friends with every person in the class within the first week. "They are remarkable," Grace said, with the tone of someone who meant it. "They are a great deal of work," Ilara said, which was also true. The translation practice was growing. By the time the boys were in school full-time, Ilara had 3 regular clients and a 4th that was becoming regular, and the work was good enough that she was no longer counting in the careful way she had counted for the first 2 years. She had paid Nell properly from the 2nd year onward, which had caused a quiet disagreement about the appropriate rate, which Nell thought was too high, and Ilara thought was not high enough, and which they had resolved by settling on a number and not discussing it again. She had a life, a real one. Not a waiting room, not a transitional space, not a pause between the life she had left and some future life she was planning toward. A genuine life with weight and texture and people she valued and work she was good at and 3 boys who were themselves and who were becoming more themselves every year. She thought about this sometimes, in the evenings after the boys were in bed and the cottage was quiet and the sea was doing its thing outside. She thought about how much of life turns on the choices made in the worst moments. She had made her choices in the worst moment, and she had made them quickly, and she had not looked back, and they had led here, to this kitchen, to this quiet, to this particular life, that she would not have predicted and could not have designed, but which was, to her continued mild astonishment, a good one. Rosalind Frey called every 6 months, not for any action, simply to maintain contact. She would say, "Nothing has changed on the legal front," and Ilara would say, "Understood," and they would talk briefly about 1 or 2 other things and then say goodbye. It was a form of maintenance, a check on a carefully preserved situation, and Ilara appreciated its regularity. In the boys' 6th year, Rosalind called and said something different. She said, "There is news from the Caldermere estate. I thought you should know." "Tell me," Ilara said. The news was that the question of succession had become official. Hadrian and Celeste had been trying for several years, and the medical reality was now formally established. There would be no children from that marriage. The Caldermere family solicitors had begun the process of identifying how the dukedom would pass, and the picture was not encouraging. The nearest male relative on the Caldermere line was a second cousin who lived in Auckland, New Zealand, had no connection to the family, and who was, by all accounts, entirely uninterested in the title, the estate, or England in general. The Caldermere estate, one of the oldest and largest in the country, was looking at the prospect of title extinction or passage to a person who had never set foot in the house. "The Dowager Duchess has become involved," Rosalind said. "Irene Caldermere has formally commissioned an inquiry into all possible legitimate heirs." Ilara sat with the phone in her hand and felt the world, very quietly, shift. "She will reach us eventually," Rosalind said. "I know," Ilara said. "Are you ready?" Ilara looked through the kitchen window at the garden, where Marcus was climbing the apple tree that she had told him at least 11 times was not rated for his ambition, and where Aldrich was sitting on the garden bench reading, and where Cale was explaining something to the cat that belonged to the Caldwells next door, and which spent most of its time in their garden without invitation. 3 boys, 6 years old, strong and certain and entirely themselves. "Almost," she said. She spent the following week doing 3 things. She spoke to Rosalind at length about the current legal position and what she should and should not say when the Caldermere inquiry reached her. She spoke to Owen, who came to Porthaven for the weekend and sat in the garden with her while the boys ran around them, and who listened and asked the right questions and at the end said simply, "Whatever you need." And she sat with each of the boys separately and told them that the time was getting closer when the other part of their story would become known, and that she was going to manage it, and that they were going to be all right. Marcus said, "How do you know we will be all right?" She said, "Because I am very careful, and because we are very strong, and because the 3 of you are the most certain thing I have ever known in my life." He looked at her in the way he had looked at things since he was 2 weeks old, like he was taking measurements. Then he nodded. "All right," he said, which was the highest form of agreement Marcus offered to anything, and which she accepted with the gratitude it deserved. She went to bed that night, and lay in the dark and listened to the sea, and felt, underneath the careful management and the legal strategy and the controlled preparation, a current of something she had almost forgotten she was carrying, something that had been waiting for 8 years and had never once gone cold. She was ready for what came next. She had always known it was coming. She had been building toward it, quietly and without announcement, for the entire time she had been here. She had built her children into people who could withstand it. She had built herself into someone who could manage it. The inquiry would reach her. The secret would end. And when it did, it would not be on anyone else's terms. It would be on hers. She had made sure of that. She slept, and in the morning there was school and translation work and the apple tree that still needed an 11-to-1 conversation with Marcus about appropriate structural trust. And the sea was doing its particular thing outside, and the life she had built continued forward, which was what it had always done. Rosalind Frey had a gift for understatement that Alara had come to appreciate deeply over the 8 years they had worked together. When Rosalind said something was going to be complicated, it meant it was going to be very complicated indeed. When she said it was interesting, she usually meant it was legally extraordinary. When she said the situation had evolved, she meant it had moved faster than either of them had expected, and they needed to discuss it immediately. She said that on a Monday morning in October, when the boys were 8 years old and in the middle of autumn term, and Alara was halfway through a translation of a particularly dense contract between 2 German pharmaceutical companies. She put down her pen when she heard Rosalind's tone and said, "Tell me." The Caldermere inquiry had found them. Not directly, not yet. But the net had drawn close enough that Rosalind expected contact within weeks. The Dowager Duchess Irene, who was 73 years old and, by all professional accounts, still in full command of her considerable intelligence, had hired a firm specializing in heritage succession cases, and that firm had been working methodically through every possible avenue. They had discovered the timing irregularity in the annulment papers. They had identified that the marriage had been, at the relevant moment, legally intact, and they had, through a combination of public record searches and patient professional legwork, established that Alara had been present in Porthaven for the past 8 years, and had not married again. "They do not know about the children yet," Rosalind said. "But they will. The question is whether you want to get in front of this or let them arrive at it." Alara was quiet for a moment. "Getting in front of it means what?" "It means you approach the Caldermere solicitors formally, through me, and you disclose. You set the terms of the disclosure. You bring evidence of the children's birth dates and legal parentage. You present the medical records. You establish the timeline cleanly and without anyone having to dig for it, and you control the narrative from the first moment it enters the legal record. And if I wait? If you wait, they find it themselves, which they will. At that point you are reacting instead of acting. The legal position does not change, but the tone does. You look as if you were hiding, even though technically you were not legally obligated to disclose." "I was not hiding," Alara said. "I know that," Rosalind said, "but I would rather the first thing the Caldermere solicitors know about you is that you walked in the front door, not that they found you through a back one." Alara understood this perfectly. She had always understood it. She had simply been waiting for the moment that felt right, and here it was, wrapped in legal strategy and arriving faster than she had planned. "Give me a week," she said. She used the week well. She spoke to Rosalind 3 more times and planned the precise structure of the disclosure. She called Owen and told him the time had come. She spoke to Barbara Trent, who was not involved in the Caldermere legal matter but whose counsel Alara valued on the question of strategy and approach. Barbara listened and then said, "You know, the most important thing is to stay very calm and very clear and let the law do what the law is going to do. You have an extremely strong position. Do not let anyone make you feel otherwise." Alara wrote that down and put it somewhere she could see it. She did not tell the boys immediately. She told them that evening that things were moving and that she was handling them and that she would let them know when there was something specific to know. Marcus looked at her with his measuring look. Aldrich went very still. Cale said, "Is it going to be noisy?" She thought about that. "Possibly," she said. "I don't mind noisy," Cale said, which was true of him in all contexts and which made her smile. The formal disclosure happened on a Friday. Rosalind submitted a legal brief to the Caldermere succession solicitors that laid out the facts in precise and careful order. It included the boys' birth certificates. It included the medical records confirming the pregnancy and the timeline. It included the documentation of the annulment and the timeline irregularity. It included a formal legal analysis, commissioned by Rosalind, of the children's status under the relevant succession laws, which was thorough and unambiguous. By Monday, the Caldermere solicitors had been in contact with Rosalind's office 3 times. By Wednesday, the Dowager Duchess herself had requested a meeting. Alara expected a letter or a formal summons through legal channels. What arrived instead, on a wet Thursday morning, was a black car at the end of the cottage lane, and from it stepped a tall woman in her 70s, with white hair and a gray coat, and the carriage of someone who had spent 60 years being watched in public, and had never once let the watching change how she moved. Ilara had met Irene Caldermere twice during the marriage. She had found her formidable and a little frightening, in the way that people are frightening when they are entirely clear about who they are and what they want. She watched Irene Caldermere walk up the cottage path, and thought that 8 years had not softened anything visible about her. The spine was the same. The eyes were the same. Irene knocked. Ilara opened the door. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, during which the two women looked at each other. "May I come in?" Irene asked. Her voice was exactly as Ilara remembered it. "Yes," Ilara said and stepped back. She had told Nell to take the boys to the beach for the morning, which at this time of year meant proper coats and determination, but Nell had been perfectly willing, because she understood the significance of what was happening, and she agreed it should happen without an audience of 8-year-old boys, however emotionally resilient they were. Ilara made tea, because making tea was something to do with the awkward minutes. Irene sat at the kitchen table and looked around the cottage with an expression that was not quite what Ilara would have expected. She had expected something like disapproval, the dowager's version of assessment. What she saw instead was something more complicated. "This is a good house," Irene said finally. "It is a good cottage," Ilara said. "There is a difference." Irene looked at her, and something shifted in her expression that might, in a different person, have been the beginning of a smile. "There is," she agreed. She accepted the tea. She held the cup with both hands, which Ilara recognized as the gesture of a person who is cold, and she looked at the kitchen table, and for a moment she was simply an old woman in a kitchen, which was not quite how Ilara had ever expected to see her. "I owe you an apology," Irene said. Ilara sat across from her and did not speak. "I knew the marriage was not right," Irene said. "I knew it for years. Hadrian has always had my stubbornness and none of my judgment, which is the worst possible inheritance from a parent. I should have handled it differently. I handled it by hoping it would correct itself." She paused. "Things rarely correct themselves." "No," Ilara agreed. "I did not know he was going to end it the way he did. I want you to know that. When I found out, I was furious with him. It was handled badly, and it was done badly, and I was not consulted, and he will carry that particular knowledge of my opinion for the rest of his life." "I believe you," Ilara said, and she did, because Irene Caldermere was not the kind of person who said things she did not mean. "The children," Irene said, and then stopped, because something was happening to her face that she was visibly managing. "They are at the beach," Ilara said. "They will be back in 2 hours." Irene nodded. She set down her cup. She looked at her hands for a moment. "3 boys," she said. "3 boys. And they are healthy. They are very healthy," Ilara said. "They are 8 years old, and they have never once, in 8 years, done anything quietly when they could do it loudly." Irene made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, brief and genuine. "Hadrian was exactly that way," she said. "Exactly." She shook her head. "3 of them. Marcus, Aldrich, and Cale," Ilara said. Irene repeated the names softly. "Those are good names." "Thank you. They are their own names for themselves, whatever else they turn out to be." Irene looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that was direct and serious. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I am not here to take anything from you, or to challenge the life you have built. I am here because I am 73 years old, and the last thing I want is for my grandchildren to not know I exist, if they are willing, on whatever terms you set." Ilara held that for a moment. She had thought about this possibility. She had thought about it from several angles over the past week. She had decided that whatever she felt about Hadrian, and whatever she felt about the years that had passed, Irene Caldermere had not wronged her personally in any decisive way. Inadequacy was not the same as malice, and grandmothers were a thing she could not be to her boys herself, and her own mother was gone. And the idea of denying her sons a grandmother on the basis of a grudge that was not even specifically about this woman, felt, when she examined it, like a form of meanness she did not want to practice. "They know who their father is," Ilara said. "In general terms, they know the situation. I am not going to hide any of this from them. When you meet them, they will know who you are." "Good," Irene said, immediately. "And I set the terms. Not the Caldermere solicitors, not Hadrian, not anyone else. Me." "Yes," Irene said. "That seems exactly right." They sat with their tea in the small kitchen, and outside the sea was gray and the wind was up and the Caldwell's cat was making its usual unauthorized visit to the garden. and Alara thought about how strange it was that the moment she had been managing toward for 8 years had arrived in the form of an old woman, with cold hands and a look on her face that was, underneath everything, simply longing. The boys came back at noon, loud and salt-smelling and full of news about a seal they had seen from the path, which Cale had named Gerald, and which Aldrich had pointed out they could not name because they did not own it, and which Marcus had settled by noting that naming something and owning it were different things. They came through the kitchen door in a gust of cold air and stopped when they saw the woman at the kitchen table. Marcus looked at Irene. He looked at Alara. Then he looked back at Irene. Alara watched him doing the thing he did, measuring, assessing. "This is Irene," Alara said. "She is your father's mother, which makes her your grandmother." The words settled in the room. Cale said, "We have a grandmother?" "It appears so," Alara said. Cale turned to Irene with the directness of someone who had never in his life been shy. "Do you know about Gerald the Seal?" he asked. Irene Caldermere looked at Cale, and this time the expression on her face did not need managing, and she did not try to manage it. "Tell me about Gerald," she said. And Cale told her, and Aldrich added the part about nomenclature not implying ownership, and Marcus sat down at the kitchen table across from his grandmother with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust, and Nell stood in the doorway with the same expression she had worn the night the boys were born, and the sea outside continued to do its thing, entirely without regard for the extraordinary fact that was quietly assembling itself in this small kitchen in this small cottage at the edge of everything. Alara stood at the stove and made more tea and let them talk, because some moments were better entered than directed. She had spent 8 years directing. She could afford to let this one unfold on its own. The seal story ran long, as Cale's stories always did, and by the end Irene Caldermere was nodding along and asking follow-up questions with the seriousness you apply to things that matter to someone you have just decided you want to know. And Alara listened to this and felt the particular complicated feeling of a person who has protected something for a very long time and has just, carefully and on her own terms, begun to let a little of the world in. It was the right time. She had always known she would know when the right time was. She had been right. The news moved through certain circles the way certain news always does. Fast, distorted at the edges, and with an appetite that fed on the details people filled in when the real ones were not yet available. What the world knew in the first days was that the Duke of Caldermere had 3 legitimate sons by his former wife, that these sons had been living quietly on the southern coast for 8 years, and that the question of the Caldermere succession was no longer the crisis it had appeared to be. What the world did not know, because Alara had been very deliberate about this, was anything more specific than that. Rosalind had advised against any public statement, and Alara had agreed without much deliberation. Silence, she had learned, was a resource. People filled it with what they expected, and what they expected was mostly drama, which meant they wrote their own story and tired of it faster. A public statement invited questions. Questions invited more statements. More statements created a presence in public discourse that she did not want, because public discourse was not a place she intended to live. Hadrian's response to the disclosure came through his solicitors, which she had expected, and it was formal and measured, which she had also expected, because Hadrian was a man who managed difficulty through professional distance. The solicitors requested a meeting to discuss the situation. Rosalind's response was courteous and clear. Mrs. Voss was happy to engage through legal representatives on any formal matters. Any direct approach to Mrs. Voss's person or to her children would not be appropriate at this stage. They had discussed what Hadrian's specific feelings might be. Alara's view was that she did not know and was not going to speculate, because speculating about the interior of someone who had surprised her before was not a useful activity. Rosalind's view was that legally, Hadrian's feelings were not relevant to the question of the children's status, which was already determined. What was relevant was whether he intended to contest the legitimacy claim, which his solicitors confirmed he did not. Whether he wanted any form of relationship with the boys was a different category of question entirely, and one that only the boys could answer in their own time. The Caldermere estate solicitors were another matter. They were efficient, professional, and under significant pressure from the entailment requirements and from the very visible fact that the dukedom now had 3 potential heirs where it had expected none. They wanted to establish legal documentation and formal recognition with a speed that Alara found reasonable, but that she insisted on managing at a pace that worked for her family. Rosalind ran interference on the timeline questions with the firm good humor of someone who had spent 4 decades being patient with people in a hurry. Celeste Miro Caldermere was the element that Alara had thought least about and that turned out to be most visible in the early weeks. She had a social circle and a relationship with certain journalists and a way of being present in certain publications that meant her response to events moved through a different channel than the formal one. She did not make statements. She simply allowed herself to be seen looking unhappy in places where being seen was the point, and the photographs made their way into publication, and the tone of the coverage around her was, for about 10 days, the kind that speculated about her feelings in a way that was designed to generate sympathy. Ilara read none of it. She had made this decision early. If she did not read it, she did not have to respond to it, and if she did not respond to it, it could not reach her. Nell monitored the coverage and told her only what was legally relevant, which was very little. Barbara Trent called once to ask if Ilara wanted her opinion on the media situation, and Ilara said no, and Barbara said good, and they talked about something else. What was occupying Ilara during this period was not the legal machinery or the public noise, it was her children. Specifically, it was the 3 8-year-old boys who were living inside this situation, and who had not asked to be the center of something enormous, and who needed, more than anything, for their daily life to keep being their daily life. She talked to them every day, not about the legal details, which were not for children, but about the general shape of what was happening. She told them that people were becoming aware of who they were, and that this was going to change some things, while not changing the important things. She asked them every evening how they were. Marcus said, in his characteristic way, that he was fine, and then specified what fine meant for him, which was that school was the same, and his friends were the same, and the things he cared about were the same. Aldrich said the library had got a new book on migratory birds that he was waiting to read, which was Aldrich's way of saying the world was continuing normally. Cale said he had explained the situation to his friend Danny Hollis, and Danny had said it sounded like something from a film, and Cale thought that was quite a good summary. Grace Hollis, who was Danny's grandmother and the boys' teacher, called Ilara during the second week. She said that if anyone at the school was making anything of the situation, she had not seen it, and that she wanted Ilara to know that as far as she was concerned, the boys were exactly as they had always been. Ilara thanked her and meant it fully. Irene Caldermere called 3 times in the first week. The calls were brief and specific. She wanted to know that the boys were all right. She gave information where she had it, and asked for nothing she was not owed. In the third call she said, carefully, that she was concerned about the media situation, and that she was willing to use her influence to manage it, if Ilara found that useful. Ilara thought about this for a day and then called back and said yes, carefully, in the narrow, specific way she wanted managed. Irene said she understood what narrow and specific meant, and she would stay within it. She did. The legal proceedings took shape over the following 2 months. The process of establishing the boys' formal status in relation to the Caldermere succession required documentation and legal submissions, and the kind of procedural patience that made Rosalind earn her fees. Ilara signed what she was asked to sign, and read everything before signing it, and asked questions when something was unclear. Rosalind found this refreshing. Most clients, she said, signed without reading, which she found professionally frustrating and personally alarming. The succession itself would not pass to the boys until Hadrian's death, which was the nature of the entailment and which was, in the present moment, an abstract future consideration. What was established now was the formal legal recognition of their legitimacy and their standing as heirs. This was a foundation, not a transfer. The boys were still 8-year-olds in a cottage in Port Haven. They were also, in the language of a very old legal tradition, the future Dukes of Caldermere. Both things were true simultaneously, and Ilara was determined that the second one would not consume the first. Owen came to Port Haven the 3rd weekend after the disclosure. He brought, as he usually did when he came for weekends, a large quantity of food and a small quantity of words. He and the boys played football in the garden until the light faded, and then came inside and ate the dinner Nell had made, and were loud and ordinary in the way that families are when they have stopped performing at each other. Ilara sat at the kitchen table and watched her brother and her sons, and felt something ease in her that had been tight for 2 months, or perhaps for 8 years. Owen stayed after the boys were in bed and sat across from Ilara with his tea. "How are you actually doing?" he asked. "I am actually doing better than I expected," she said. "The first 2 weeks were the worst. The noise of it. The feeling of being watched from a distance. Now that the legal structure is in place and Rosalind is managing the formal side, I feel less as if everything is in motion at once." "Hadrian has not tried to contact you directly?" "No, through solicitors only." "Is that what you wanted?" "It is what I specified," she said. "Whether it is what I wanted is more complicated. I think it is probably correct for this moment. What the boys eventually want with regard to their father is not something I am deciding for them." Owen was quiet for a moment. "And Irene?" "She is more than I expected. She is genuine with the boys, which is what matters. Whatever complicated feelings I have about the Caldermere family, the boys do not need to carry those feelings on my behalf." He looked at her for a moment. "You are remarkably unbitter," he said. She thought about that. I do not have the energy for bitterness, she said. I did not have it 8 years ago, and I do not have it now. There is too much to do. Most people would be bitter. Most people have different priorities. She paused. I was very angry for a while. In the beginning, I did a great deal of it alone in the evenings, and I let it run its course and it passed. The way most things pass if you do not keep feeding them. What I kept was the useful part, which is the clarity about what I want and what I will not accept. And what will you not accept? Being managed, she said immediately. By him, by his solicitors, by his family, by anyone who thinks that the disclosure of 3 legitimate heirs somehow hands them authority over how my family is run. The boys are mine. Their lives are here. Whatever title they eventually carry is an inheritance, not an instruction. Owen smiled. It was the small, warm, slightly odd smile he had been giving her at intervals since childhood, the one that meant he was proud of her in a way he found it difficult to say directly. She did not ask him to say it directly. The smile was enough. The coverage began to fade after 3 weeks, as Alara had predicted it would. Without fresh fuel, without statements or sightings or access, the story settled into the public record as a fact rather than a developing event. The Caldermere succession was resolved. The story was done, at least on the surface. Below the surface, where the real things lived, it was still going on, as all real things do. Rosalind reported that the succession lawyers were satisfied, that the formal recognition had been entered into the appropriate records, that the legal position was as clean and clear as it was going to get. The boys went back to school on a Monday morning with their book bags and their opinions about what the school canteen should serve for lunch, and the knowledge that Gerald the Seal had been spotted again by Cale's friend Danny from the coastal path. Alara watched them go down the lane from the cottage door and felt the specific feeling of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just, slightly, loosened their grip. Not fully, not yet. There were things still to come. The question of Hadrian. The question of what the title would mean to each boy as they grew into it, or pushed back against it, or found their own relationship with something so ancient and external to themselves. The question of what Irene Caldermere would be to them over time, and what she would not be, and how that would shift as they became older and formed their own assessments. All of that was coming. She knew it, and was not afraid of it. But this morning, on this Monday, in this town she had chosen and come to love, her 3 boys were walking to school with their book bags and arguing about Gerald's diet, and the sea was behind the hill, and the sky was clear, and Nell was in the kitchen doing whatever Nell did in the kitchen when no one was looking. One thing at a time. That was how you got through a thing this size. One ordinary, impossible, magnificent thing at a time. She turned and went back inside, and the door of the cottage closed behind her, and the lane was quiet, and the day had started, which was really all you could ask of a day when what you needed was simply to keep moving. The letter from Hadrian came on a Tuesday, 2 months after the legal process had settled into its formal shape. It was handwritten, which she had not expected. She had expected something mediated through solicitors, something measured and formal and deliberately impersonal. This was neither of those things. It was 2 pages, in his familiar careful handwriting, and it was addressed to her by name, and it arrived in an ordinary envelope with no return address, as if he had taken it to a post box himself rather than having someone handle it for him. She recognized his handwriting before she read a word of it, and she felt something move in her that was not quite any single thing but was a complex mixture of several things she did not immediately name. She took the letter to the kitchen table and read it with her hands flat on the wood beside it, not touching the pages. He said that he was aware the legal situation was now formally resolved and that he understood this was not his letter to send through solicitors. He said that he had spent 2 months trying to decide whether to contact her directly and that he had decided he should, and that he acknowledged she might not want to hear from him, and that he understood completely if she chose not to respond. He said that he had been thinking, since the disclosure, about what he had done and how he had done it. He said that he had been a coward about it. He used that word specifically. He did not dress it in more comfortable language. He said that he had let his own unhappiness justify a cruelty that he should not have permitted himself, and that he had spent several months before the disclosure understanding this, and several months after it understanding it more fully. He said that discovering he had 3 sons who were 8 years old was a fact he did not know how to sit with, and that he was still not sitting with it well, but that he was trying. He said he was not asking for anything. He said that clearly and plainly, and returned to it at the end of the letter. He was not making a request. He was simply saying for the first time that he was sorry, and that he understood if that was not a word she wanted from him, and that whatever happened from here, he hoped she knew that the boys had a father who was already proud of them, based on nothing more than what Irene had told him about them. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She did not feel the sharp heat of anger she might have expected, or the complicated stab of something she did not want to call tenderness. What she felt was more like the settling of something that had been slightly out of alignment for a very long time. She thought about the Hadrian she had known and the Hadrian who had written this letter, and she thought that they were the same person, and also not at all the same person, and that people were capable of things across time that they were not capable of in their worst moments. She was not ready to respond. She sat with the letter for a week. At the end of the week she talked to Nell, not because Nell would tell her what to do, because Nell never told her what to do, but because Nell was the person who had witnessed most of this particular story, and whose opinion she trusted more than any other. He wrote a real letter, Ilara said. I heard, Nell said. She had not read it, but she had known it existed, because Ilara kept nothing significant from her. He used the word coward. That is a hard word to use about yourself, Nell said. Yes. Ilara was quiet for a moment. I am not thinking about forgiving him. I have not got there. I might not get there. But I am thinking about what the boys will want. In 5 years. Or 10 years. When they are old enough to make their own decisions about this. And I am thinking that if he is capable of writing that letter, he is probably capable of being something to them that is not nothing. Nell said nothing, which was what she said when she agreed, and did not want to seem like she was pushing. I am not going to respond yet, Ilara said. I am going to sit with it longer, and I am going to make sure I am deciding from a clear place, and not from the part of me that is still, despite everything, a little bit angry. Take whatever time you need, Nell said. She took 3 more weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, she wrote 1 page in response. She told him that she had read the letter and that she had taken time before responding, because she wanted to respond from the right place. She told him that an apology was one thing, and that trust was another, and that she was not in a position to offer trust quickly. She told him that the boys were healthy and good, and that they already knew, in broad terms, that their father existed, and that the situation was what it was. She told him that she would not prevent them from knowing him when they were old enough to choose, and that she would not poison the well, but that how and when any relationship between him and the boys developed was something that would happen at their pace, not his, and not hers, and certainly not through any legal mechanism. She told him that she hoped he was all right, and she meant it, and then she stopped. She did not receive a reply for several weeks, and when it came it was 1 page, and it said only that he understood and that he was grateful, and that he would wait for whatever she and the boys were ready for. She filed it in the same place she had filed the first letter, in the small box of documents at the back of her wardrobe that she kept for things that mattered but were not currently active. Then she closed the wardrobe and went back to her translation work, and her garden, and her children, and her life, which were the things that were active, and which required her full attention. The boys' 9th birthday was celebrated with a party at the cottage that involved 11 of their school friends, a significant quantity of food, a football game in the garden that ended in a dispute that Aldrich mediated with solemnity, and Marcus ended by simply declaring victory on behalf of everyone, and Cale resolved by suggesting they all have cake instead. Irene Caldermere sent gifts, 3 separate packages, each addressed to a different boy, each containing something that showed she had paid careful attention to who each of them was. Marcus received a compass in a leather case, because Irene had noted his interest in directions and his habit of always knowing where north was. Aldrich received a beautiful illustrated book about birds of the British Isles, which caused him to sit down immediately in the middle of the party and begin reading it with complete absorption, which the other children accepted without comment, because this was simply Aldrich. Cale received a very fine kite, red and yellow, that he immediately took into the garden and attempted to fly without reading the instructions, which was very Cale, and which took several people and 1 untangled crash to sort out before it was properly airborne. Ilara watched the kite finally rise against the gray October sky and felt Irene Caldermere move up beside her. The old woman had begun coming to Port Haven once a month, on Sunday afternoons, in the same black car driven by the same driver who waited in the lane with a thermos and a patience that suggested he was well paid for both. She had not missed a visit. She had integrated herself into the Sunday afternoons with such careful restraint that Ilara had almost stopped noticing the care and simply noticed the presence, which she thought was exactly what Irene had intended. He is something, Irene said, watching Cale chase the kite along the garden's far edge. He is a great deal, Ilara said. They all are. Irene paused. I spent a long time hoping Hadrian would have children. I used to think about what they would be like. I could not have imagined this. What did you imagine? Irene thought about it. Something more contained, she said. More like Hadrian. One or two. Very tidy, very properly raised. She watched Marcus organizing a competition that now involved most of the party guests, and a system he had invented on the spot. Not this. Not this, Alara agreed. This is better, Irene said simply. She left at 4, as she always did, and the boys said goodbye to her with the particular warmth of children who have accepted someone into their world. Not fully, not yet, but with the genuine beginning of what might, over years, become something real. Marcus shook her hand, because Marcus had developed a handshake from somewhere and deployed it on people he respected. Aldrich told her a fact about the migration pattern of the species illustrated on page 47 of his new book. Cale hugged her, briefly and completely without warning, which was how Cale hugged everyone, and which caused something to happen briefly in Irene Caldermere's face that she managed in the usual way. The car went down the lane. The gate clicked shut. The party continued. At school the following week, Marcus got into a mild disagreement with a boy named Peter Ashby, who had read something about the Caldermere situation in his parents' newspaper, and had mentioned it with the imprecision of a child repeating adult information without fully understanding it. Peter had said that Marcus was going to be a duke, which Marcus had acknowledged was probably true eventually, and Peter had said that meant Marcus thought he was better than everyone, which Marcus had disagreed with at some length. The disagreement had been verbal, and had been resolved by Grace Hollis with efficiency. Grace told Alara at the school gate that Peter Ashby was not a mean-spirited child, just an incautious one, and that Marcus had handled himself well. He had said, she reported, that being a duke was an inheritance and not an achievement, and that no one should be treated better or worse on account of something they were born into. Alara drove home and thought about where Marcus had heard that particular argument, and realized it was from her, 2 years ago, in a slightly different context, and that he had stored it and used it, which was the kind of thing that made your heart do something strange and warm. At home in the kitchen with dinner on the stove and the boys loud in the next room and Nell reading her book in the sitting room and the sea doing its thing outside, Alara stood and thought about the shape of things. The legal structure was in place. The recognition was formal. The relationships were finding their levels. Irene, cautious and genuine. Hadrian, distant but not absent in intention. The boys, navigating their inheritance with the same matter-of-fact directness they applied to everything. She thought about the letter in the box at the back of the wardrobe and about what she would say to the boys when they eventually wanted to know more about their father than they currently did. She thought about how to make sure that what she gave them was true without being shaped by her own experience of him. She thought about fairness and about how fairness in this situation was not the same as pretending her experience had not happened. She did not have all the answers. She had never had all the answers. She had the next decision and the one after that, and she had made those one at a time for 8 years, and the method had served her well. The boys came into the kitchen for dinner with the noise and energy of people who have been confined all day and are now free, and Alara set the table, and Nell put down her book and came to help carry things, and they ate together in the small kitchen that had been at the center of everything for 8 years, and would be for as long as they stayed. Marcus asked, over dinner, if they were ever going to live somewhere bigger. Aldrich said size was not a measure of quality. Cale said he liked the cottage because the sea was nearby and he could hear it at night. Marcus said he was not saying the cottage was not good, just wondering if other options existed. Alara said that other options always existed and that for now the cottage was home and she would let him know if that changed. Marcus said, fair enough, in the tone he used when he was satisfied, and that was that. It was fair enough, more than fair enough in all the ways that actually counted. The thing about raising 3 boys in a small coastal town was that the town noticed them before they noticed the town. Port Haven was not a large place. It had a library that doubled as a community room on Thursday evenings, a pub that served food worth eating, 2 churches that held services on alternating Sundays in a spirit of ecumenical pragmatism, and a school that had known the same families for several generations. When Alara had arrived 8 years ago, under her maiden name and with Nell and 2 suitcases, the town had noted her arrival in the way small towns note all arrivals, which was to say thoroughly, without asking, and without comment. When the news of the succession broke, Port Haven did something that Alara had not fully predicted, which was very little. Jeffrey Marsh, who was now 78 and still hard of hearing, and still entirely uninterested in anyone's personal life, continued to collect rent on the 15th of the month, and fix anything that needed fixing, with the slow reliability of a man who had done this for decades. The Caldwells next door waved over the fence as they always had, and the cat continued its unauthorized garden visits. Grace Hollis taught her class as she always had. The people at the post office and the library and the fishmonger and the bakery treated Alara as they had treated her for 8 years, which was to say with the easy familiarity of people who have moved past the stage of considering you a newcomer without quite promoting you to local. Barbara Trent said, when Alara described this to her on the phone, that this was exactly what happened when you did not perform your identity for people. If you had arrived here announcing yourself, Barbara said, they would have related to the announcement. Instead, they know you. So when something large happens around you, they relate to the you they know rather than to the large thing. Alara thought about this for a while and decided it was probably right. She had not performed. She had simply been there, doing the same things every day, and the town had registered her as a person rather than as a status, and this was proving to be one of the most useful things she had ever done without intending to. There were, naturally, people who were curious in less comfortable ways. A journalist arrived in town in November, which Alara knew about because the fishmonger mentioned, entirely without alarm, that a young man had been asking questions about the family at the cottage. Rosalind had anticipated this, and they had a plan for it, which was that Alara said nothing, did not confirm anything, and directed any formal inquiry to Rosalind's office. The journalist lingered for a few days, wrote something that was thin on specific detail because he had very little to work with, and left. The piece appeared in a national publication and contained nothing Alara found objectionable, partly because it contained almost nothing specific at all. A second journalist tried 3 months later and had the same experience, and Alara assumed the word had spread in whatever circles journalists spread words that Porthaven was not yielding results. What the situation had done, in its public dimension, was establish a fact in the world. The boys existed. Their status was real and legal and documented. They were, in the formal language of the institution, the heirs to Caldermere. That was in the record and would remain in the record regardless of anything else. Alara had always known that this was the goal, not drama, not confrontation, not public vindication, but simply the establishment of a clear and clean truth that no one could subsequently unmake. She had achieved it. The fact was now in the world and it was not going anywhere. What she focused on now was what she had always focused on, the daily reality of 3 boys growing up. They were 9 years old when the news broke, and they were 10 when the noise of it had fully faded, and by the time they were 11 they had largely integrated the fact of their inheritance into the fabric of who they were without it dominating. They had become, over those 3 years, interesting people to know. This was not Alara's opinion. This was the opinion of Grace Hollis, who taught them through to the end of primary school, and who said at the final parents' meeting that she would miss them more than most of the students she had taught in 15 years. It was the opinion of Danny Hollis, who was Cale's closest friend, and who had weathered the succession news with the admirable pragmatism of someone whose main concern was whether Cale would still come to his birthday party, which Cale of course did. It was the opinion of the librarian, who had been ordering books for Aldrich, based on his previous choices, since the age of 8, and who had said, once, that Aldrich had better taste in non-fiction than most adults she knew. Marcus, at 11, was already showing what he would be, which was someone who would lead because he could not help it, and because it was also what people needed him to do. He was not arrogant. He was simply forward, always, and people followed forward things. He had organized the Year 6 Leavers production, directed the football league schedule, and mediated a dispute between 2 families at the school fundraiser that Grace Hollis said had been threatening to become genuinely unpleasant before Marcus appeared and solved it with a calm that made him seem much older than he was. He was going to be, Alara thought, someone who ran things. How he chose to run them was the open question, and the one she spent the most thought on. Aldrich had decided, at 10, that he was going to be a naturalist. He had not phrased it as a decision so much as a statement of fact. He had been reading about conservation biology and had asked Owen, who worked in environmental policy, if he knew anyone who did this work. Owen, who was careful about things like this, did not make promises but said he would look into it. 3 months later, Aldrich had been corresponding with a researcher in Scotland who studied seabird populations, which had started as a school project and had become something that was clearly going to run much longer than any school project. The researcher, a woman named Dr. Fiona Mack, had written to Alara separately to say that Aldrich's questions were the most precise she had received from anyone outside of professional academia, and that she hoped he kept at it. Cale was the one who held them all together, though he did not know this, and would have been puzzled if you told him. He was the warmth in the room, the person who looked for where someone was left out and included them without making it obvious, the one who laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the wrong ones in a way that was not withdrawal but attention. His teacher at primary school had told Alara that Cale had a gift for people, and that he should be encouraged to trust it. Alara had said she was not sure Cale needed encouragement. The gift seemed to operate on its own schedule. His teacher had agreed that was a fair observation. She thought about them constantly, not with anxiety, which had been her companion in the earliest years and which had slowly, as the boys grew into themselves, become less necessary. She thought about them with the particular attention of someone who is responsible for something that matters and who understands that getting it right means watching carefully and adjusting continuously and never allowing yourself to believe the work is done. She had, over the years, developed a set of principles about how to raise them in the context of what they were. She had never written these down and they would not have survived a list very well. But they existed, consistently, as the structure underneath her daily decisions. The first was that the inheritance was theirs to choose. She would not tell them what to do with it or who to be because of it. She would make sure they understood what it was, what it meant historically and legally and practically. But whether Marcus became the Duke of Caldermere in any real active sense, or whether he lived the role minimally, or found his own way through it, was his decision and his alone. She had fought for their right to exist in that inheritance. She was not going to then manage how they used it. The second was that Porthaven was their home first. She would not move them to be closer to the Caldermere estate, or to facilitate the social world that the title implied. If they chose later to engage with that world, she would support them. But their base was here, in this town, with these people, by this sea. Their roots were already down. She was not pulling them up. The third was that Hadrian was their question to answer. She had, after careful thought and a conversation with Rosalind about the legal dimensions, allowed Irene to tell Hadrian directly that the boys knew who he was, and that when they were old enough to decide, they could choose to know him or not. She had told the boys this herself, in the kitchen, on an ordinary evening when the conversation turned in that direction naturally. She had said that their father was a person with his own story and his own things he had done right and wrong, and that she was going to make sure they had access to him when they wanted it, and that she was not going to shape what they thought of him. They could do that themselves. Marcus had said, "Have you forgiven him?" She had thought about that for a long moment. "I am working on it," she had said. "It is not a fast process." Marcus had nodded, with the air of someone noting information without judgment. "I want to meet him," he said. "Not yet. But eventually." "I know," she said. "I will make sure that happens." The conversation moved on. The boys ate their dinner. The sea was doing its thing outside. She had not yet fully forgiven Hadrian. She had thought about this carefully and honestly, because she believed in being honest with herself even about things that were slow and unglamorous. She had moved past anger. She had reached something that was perhaps closer to acceptance, which was not the same as forgiveness but was in that general direction. She understood, more clearly than she had at 34, that he had been a person in a marriage that had not worked, who had handled the exit from it very badly. She understood that badly handled things were not always evidence of bad character, only of inadequate tools for difficult moments. She understood that the 8 years she had lived without him had been, despite everything, the fullest years of her life. None of that was forgiveness, but it was a map in that direction, and she was walking. Irene Caldermere came on her Sunday visits and brought herself and her attention and occasionally a book or a small interesting object and very occasionally news about the estate, delivered matter-of-factly without expectation that Alara would respond in any particular way. The boys had settled into their relationship with her with the easy adaptability of children who have decided someone is worth their time. Marcus talked to her about the mechanics of the estate, which he had begun researching with a methodical interest that suggested he was already thinking about what the inheritance would eventually require of him. Aldrich shared his work with Dr. Mack and had, in the past year, discovered that Irene had a long-standing interest in the bird populations on the Caldermere estate's land, which created a channel between them that neither of them had expected, and which Alara found quietly delightful. Cale made her laugh. Every visit, without fail, through the pure mechanism of being himself. Alara watched this, and thought that this was, in its way, also something she had built. Not deliberately, not by plan, but by the long-sustained practice of building things carefully, and then standing back and letting them become what they were going to become. Outside the cottage, the sea was doing its thing, as it had been doing for the entire time she had lived here, and would presumably continue to do long after. The gulls were arguing over something on the beach below the coastal path. The lavender in the window boxes was doing well this year, the best it had ever done in the 8 years she had been tending it. She stood in the kitchen and thought about none of this consciously. She was making dinner and thinking about a translation that needed attention tomorrow, and whether she had remembered to order the thing that Geoffrey Marsh had said he was coming to fix on Thursday. She was thinking about ordinary things, which was the greatest gift of a life that had become its own reality. She was, she thought, not becoming, not trying to be, simply being, a woman in a kitchen by the sea with 3 good sons and a life she had made. It was not what she had planned at 34, standing in a hallway outside her husband's study door. It was better, Marcus was 14 the first time he met his father. He arranged it himself, which was entirely consistent with who he was. He had been thinking about it for 2 years, he told Ilara. Not obsessively but consistently, in the way he thought about things that were important and not yet resolved. He had decided, at 14, that he was old enough to form his own opinion, and that forming his own opinion required actual evidence, and that actual evidence required a meeting. He came to Ilara and told her this on a Thursday evening after dinner. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and presented it the way he presented things, clearly and directly and without drama. He said he wanted to meet his father. He said he understood if there were things she needed to manage on that front and he was willing to wait for her to do that. He said he was not asking her to be part of the meeting just to make it possible. Ilara had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it because Marcus was the kind of person who, once he had decided something, moved toward it with the inevitability of tide. She had prepared for it in the way she prepared for most things, by thinking about it carefully in advance so that when it arrived she could respond from a clear place rather than a reactive one. "Do you want to talk about what you are hoping to get from it?" she asked. Marcus thought about this, which she appreciated. He did not brush the question aside. "I want to see if I can understand him," he said. "I want to see who he is, not from other people telling me, from me." "That is fair," she said. "Are you all right with it?" She looked at her eldest son, 14 years old with his father's jaw and her eyes, and she thought about all the versions of this moment she had imagined over the years. "I am," she said. "Yes." She called Rosalind the next morning. Rosalind said the communication channel was open and she could put the request through and Hadrian's solicitors would receive it and respond. She expected a response within the week. The response came in 4 days. Hadrian agreed immediately. The meeting was arranged for the following month at a neutral location, a hotel in a city that was equidistant between Porthaven and the Caldermere estate, which Rosalind had suggested and which Ilara thought was good logic. She did not go. She dropped Marcus at the train station and watched him board with his school bag over one shoulder and the particular set of his spine that meant he was composed rather than comfortable, which was the Marcus version of nervous. And she thought that she had never been more proud of someone in her life, and also that she would rather be anywhere else in the world than standing on a train platform not going with him. She went home and did her translation work, and did not sit by the phone, because sitting by the phone would not make anything happen faster, and she walked the coastal path twice. And she made a pie that took 2 hours because the pastry needed attention, and attention to the pastry prevented attention to the clock. Marcus came back on the 6 o'clock train. She picked him up at the station. He got into the car and sat for a moment without speaking, which was not unusual for Marcus in the immediate aftermath of something significant. "How was it?" she asked. He thought. "Strange," he said. "He looks like me, or I look like him. I knew that, from the photographs Irene showed us. But knowing it and seeing it in person is different." "Yes," she said. "He was nervous," Marcus said. "He tried to hide it. He was not very good at hiding it. I think he is not used to being on unequal ground." "Probably not," she said. "He talked about the estate a lot. At first, I think that was what he was comfortable with. I asked him some questions about how it operates, and his eyes were different when he talked about that. More himself. Less performing." She drove and let him talk at his own pace, which was the right thing to do with Marcus. He asked about us, about the 3 of us. I told him about Aldrich and Dr. Mack and the Seabird research, and he did not know what to do with that at all, which was sort of funny. He said he did not know what to say about someone Aldrich's age doing actual research. I said that was because Aldrich was unusual. He seemed to agree. "Did you talk about anything important?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I asked him why," he said. She kept her eyes on the road. "What did he say?" "He said he was not as brave as he should have been, and that he knew it, and that there was nothing he could say that would make it a smaller thing than it was. He said he was sorry." "Did you believe him?" Marcus considered. "I think he is sorry," he said. "I think sorry is real. I do not think sorry changes what happened. I think those are both true at the same time." "Yes," she said, "they are." He looked out the window at the fields going past in the early evening light. "I want to see him again," he said. "Not all the time, but again. I want to keep forming the opinion. Then we will arrange it," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "Thank you," and the tone of it was not the automatic thank you of a child, but the conscious one, of a person who understands what they are thanking someone for. She did not respond to that directly. She drove and let the evening be what it was. Aldrich met Hadrian 6 months after Marcus, in a different way. He asked for a letter exchange before a meeting, because he wanted to form an impression through words first, which was Aldrich's way of doing most things. The letter exchange lasted 3 months and was, according to Rosalind, who was mildly surprised to hear it had been requested, something she had not encountered before in this type of situation. Ilara told her that Aldrich was not going to do things the way they were usually done. By the time they met in person, Aldrich had already decided what he thought, which was characteristic. He told Ilara afterward that Hadrian was more thoughtful than he had expected and less comfortable with himself than he had expected, which he described as sad rather than bad. He said he did not know yet what the relationship would look like. He said he was going to continue corresponding, because the correspondence had been interesting and he saw no reason to stop something that was working. Cale was the last, not because he had any hesitation, but because he had been watching his brothers and forming his own approach, which was also Cale. He asked Ilara, when Marcus and Aldrich had both met Hadrian, whether she had ever thought about meeting him again herself. She looked at her youngest son, who was 12 years old, and who asked questions with the precision of someone twice that age without ever losing the warmth that made them bearable to receive. "I have thought about it," she said honestly. "Do you want to?" "I do not know yet," she said. "It is a different thing for me than it is for you." Cale nodded. "Because you knew him before," he said. "And we only know the after." "Yes," she said. "Exactly." Cale met Hadrian 2 weeks later and came back with a very direct assessment, which was that his father was someone who had done something he should not have done, and knew it, and was spending whatever time remained to him trying to be better than he had been, and that this was both enough and not quite enough, and that Cale intended to be his own judge of it over time. Ilara had not used the word forgiveness with her sons. She had not told them how to feel or what to conclude, and yet each of them, in their own way, had arrived at something that was more generous than she might have predicted, which told her something about who they were, and something about the fact that she had not poisoned the well, and something about Hadrian that she was still working out. She was 44 years old, the boys were 12 and growing fast. The cottage that had once felt large enough for the 4 of them and Nell was beginning to feel its dimensions more specifically. Ilara had been thinking about the question of space, not urgently but steadily, in the way she thought about practical things that had a timeline. Rosalind called on a Wednesday afternoon, not about Hadrian, about the estate's management board, which had formally requested that the boys be given introductions to the people who ran the Caldermere estate on a day-to-day basis, for the educational purpose of ensuring that the eventual heirs had some grounding in the institution they would inherit. It was a reasonable request, and it had been made reasonably. Ilara said she would discuss it with the boys. She discussed it over dinner on Friday, when all 3 were present, and the food was good, and the mood was settled, which were the conditions she had always found best for conversations that mattered. She laid out the request plainly and asked what they thought. Marcus said he thought it was a good idea. He had been thinking about the estate's operational structure and he had questions that only the people who ran it could answer. Aldrich said he would participate if there were people who could speak to the land management and wildlife aspects, which he suspected there were. Cale said sure, if they were going, he was going, and also could they stop somewhere interesting on the way. She called Rosalind the next morning and said yes. The visit to the Caldermere estate was arranged for the early spring, which gave enough time to plan it properly, and which also meant it was a school holiday, and the boys would not miss any days, which Ilara was strict about, because she was strict about school in the way that people are strict about things they believe matter. She did not go herself. She had decided this without great deliberation. It was right for the boys to go as themselves, not as her children. They were people now, not just small people, and they did not need her present to have an experience. Owen went with them, because he was the family member who would be unruffled by large houses and formal introductions, and Irene met them at the estate, which was her house in the truest sense and in which she was, by all subsequent accounts, entirely at ease in the way that people are at ease in places they have known all their lives. Ilara spent the weekend in Porthaven with Nell. They walked the coastal path on Saturday and went to the pub for dinner on Saturday evening, which they did perhaps 4 times a year, and which Ilara always enjoyed more than she expected to. On Sunday she worked in the garden, which was at its best in spring, and she listened to the sea and thought about her boys in the grand rooms of a house she had visited many times when she was married to a man she had tried to love and had eventually stopped trying, and she thought about the peculiarity of how things move through time. She thought about what she had built, which was not what she had planned to build and was not what anyone looking at her life at 34 would have predicted. She thought about Nell and Owen and Rosalind and Barbara and Grace Hollis and Jeffrey Marsh and the Caldwell's cat and the herb garden and the lavender and the boys and what they were becoming, and the slow, unhurried, completely unglamorous work of a well-lived life. She thought that she was lucky, which was not a word she had allowed herself much in the early years when luck had felt like an insult, but which she could use now without difficulty, because luck was not only what happened to you, it was also what you made of what happened to you. The boys came back Sunday evening, loud and full of stories. Marcus had met the estate manager and had about 47 questions he was writing down. Aldrich had spent an unexpected hour with the estate's land conservationist and had looked, according to Owen, like someone who had found their exact right place in the world. Cale had charmed everyone in the building and had also, somehow, acquired a friendship with the youngest member of the kitchen staff, a girl named Ellie, who was 14 and who had given him her email address and with whom Cale would correspond, cheerfully and platonically, for the next 3 years. They sat at the kitchen table and talked over each other and interrupted each other with the particular chaos of 3 people who were each having a different experience of the same day, and Nell made tea and Owen sat with his tea and listened to his nephews and smiled in the quiet way Owen always smiled. Alara sat at the head of the table and listened to all of it and thought, this is the thing, not the grand moment of legal vindication, not the public recognition, not the formal establishment of the boys' place in the official record of an ancient institution. This was the thing. This kitchen, this noise, this impossible overflowing ordinary life. She was 44 years old and she had built exactly this, piece by patient piece, and it was good. The sea was outside, doing its thing. It had been doing it for the entire time she had been here, and it would go on doing it after everything she knew was done, which was one of the things she found most useful about the sea. It was a reminder of scale, of how large the world was, and how long it ran, and how small and significant each life within it was simultaneously. She looked at her 3 sons around her kitchen table, and she was glad. That was enough. That was everything, and it was enough. The first time Marcus came back to Port Haven with a child of his own, he arrived the same way he always had. In the old estate car he preferred to the newer cars available to him, without announcement until the night before, pulling up the lane in the gray afternoon light with his jacket still carrying traces of the morning's work, and his eyes doing the particular brightening they did when he saw the cottage. He was 32 years old. His son George was 2. George had his grandfather Hadrian's jaw and his grandmother Alara's eyes, and a volume setting that appeared to have been calibrated for an open field, which in a cottage the size of theirs required a certain structural commitment from everyone present. He also had, from the first moment he came through the door, a complete indifference to the fact that this was his grandmother's house, treating it instead as a territory to be explored with a thoroughness that Alara recognized from about 30 years of prior experience with this family's males. Alara was 62 years old. She was still in Port Haven. She had stayed, long after the boys were grown and long after the various legal structures had settled, and long after the question of the Caldermere succession had become something the estate's professional management handled with the competence that professional management was paid to provide. She had stayed because this was her place. She had known it since the 2nd year, and the knowing had only deepened since. Nell was 75, and had her own place in the town now, a flat above the bakery that she had moved into when the boys started secondary school, and the cottage had genuinely begun to feel too small. She remained, as she had always been, exactly present when needed and entirely elsewhere when not. She came on Tuesday evenings and on some Sundays, and when the boys came back she arrived on whatever day they arrived and stayed as long as suited her, because that was how Nell had always operated, and no one had any interest in changing it. Marcus sat at the kitchen table while George dismantled the magazine rack with scientific curiosity, and told Alara about the estate. He was its effective manager now. Hadrian was still alive, at 73, but his health had been unreliable for several years, and the practical running of Caldermere had moved steadily toward Marcus, which Marcus had accepted with the same forward commitment he brought to everything. He had not waited to inherit. He had understood, sometime in his mid-20s, that understanding a thing required doing it, not watching it, and he had moved into the work with the appetite of someone who had always known it was coming and had been ready for it for several years already. He reported on the land conservation project, because Aldrich had been advising on it for the past 4 years, and Marcus always updated Alara on Aldrich's work when they were together, because Aldrich's work was something they were all privately proud of and publicly understated about, which was the family way. The Seabird project that had begun with Dr. Mack had grown into a full environmental research program based on the Caldermere land, which was large enough and diverse enough in its habitats to be genuinely interesting to conservation scientists, and Aldrich was the head of it at 32 and doing exactly what he had decided at 10 years old he was going to do, which Alara thought was as close to luck as she understood the word. Cale was in Edinburgh. He had been running a community development organization for 4 years, which involved the kind of work that required everything he was: the warmth, the reading of people, the capacity to be present with someone who needed presence. He had a partner named Francis, who was 30 and had sharp eyes and a very dry sense of humor that Alara liked immediately, and which complemented Cale's effortless warmth in the way that complementary things do when they are found by people who know what they need. He was coming in 2 days with Francis, and they were going to stay the weekend, and the cottage was going to be the particular kind of full that Alara found exhausting in advance and entirely right in practice. She looked at George, who had finished with the magazine rack and moved on to investigating the lower kitchen shelves with the focused intent of a small person who knew there were interesting things in the world and was going to find them. Marcus watched him with the particular expression that parents of very active 2-year-olds develop, which was a combination of perpetual readiness and genuine amusement. "He is a great deal," Alara said. "He is my great deal," Marcus said, which was the tone he used for things he was entirely sure about. She left them and walked to the coastal path in the late afternoon. She walked it every day that the weather allowed, which in Port Haven, and with her particular understanding of what weather allowed, was most days. The path had changed in 24 years in small increments. A new section of fencing here, a repaired stretch of stone there, the addition of a bench near the headland that the town council had put in 3 years ago, and which she used more often than she had expected. The sea had not changed. The sea never changed in the ways that mattered. She walked and thought about the evening, which would be Marcus and George and Nell arriving at some point with the particular energy she brought to the presence of great-grandchildren. And she thought about the weekend with Cale and Francis, and she thought about Aldrich, who would not be here this trip because his research schedule was uncompromising in autumn, but who had called last week and talked for an hour about a data set he was working through and who would visit at Christmas with the same person he had been with for 6 years, a quiet marine biologist named Edward who had the same quality of careful attention as Aldrich, and who fitted into the family with the ease of something that was always going to be there. She thought about what she had not expected. She had not expected Hadrian to become, over 15 years of careful and irregular contact, something approaching genuine. He was not a friend. The word did not fit. He was the father of her children and a person she had known for a very long time and with whom she had worked out, slowly and with the patience that only time provides, something that was not warm but was honest. He had been at Marcus's wedding 4 years ago, and they had spoken briefly, and she had looked at him and thought that he was a man who had learned something expensive and was still learning it, which was the most you could say about most people. She had not expected Irene Caldermere to become something she genuinely looked forward to. The Sunday visits had continued for years, adjusting their shape as the boys grew and the distances changed, until Irene was in her late 80s and no longer traveling easily, and the visits had reversed, with Alara and the boys going to Caldermere when they could, and Irene managing the phone with the efficiency she had always brought to everything. She had died 2 years ago, at 89, in her own house, with Marcus and Aldrich and Cale around her. She had been, at the end, to each of them, genuinely their grandmother. Not a replacement for what they had never had from her son's side of things. Something of its own kind. She had not expected, most of all, how ordinary it would become, the extraordinary fact of her life, that she had been discarded and had survived and rebuilt, and had seen 3 sons become men, and had watched the institution that had first excluded them become theirs by patient right. It had been, at its core, extraordinary, and yet it was now simply the shape of her life, which she lived in the ordinary way, day by day, translation work and garden and coastal walk and the Tuesday evenings with Nell, and the phone calls with her sons, and the particular quality of light over the water in every season. She had not sought vindication. She had not wanted it. Vindication was for people who needed the world to acknowledge something that the world had denied them, and the world had not denied her anything that she had not then found another way to obtain. She had her 3 boys and their lives and their children arriving now or coming soon, and she had her own work and her own life and her own place in this small town by the sea, and none of that required the world's acknowledgement. She stood at the headland and looked out at the water. The light was that particular late afternoon gold that she had been watching for 24 years and that she had never quite managed to describe to anyone who had not seen it, and that was, she still thought, a reason to stay. She thought about the kitchen that evening when she had first sat there alone with cold tea and a letter and a choice about what to do next. She was not that woman now. She was the woman she had become on the other side of the choice she had made, which was a different and, she thought, a more complete person than the one who had stood in the hallway outside her husband's study door and said, with a steadiness she had almost not managed, "All right." She had been all right. She had been more than all right. She had been, across the whole of it, exactly as stubborn and as patient and as clear about what mattered as she had always suspected she could be if required. The requirement had arrived, unexpected and unwanted, and she had risen to it, Not because she was remarkable, but because the alternative was to be diminished, and she was not a person who allowed that. She turned and walked back along the path toward the cottage. The gulls were doing their thing. The sea was doing its thing. The wind was doing what the wind always did in this particular place, which was arrive from the west and make you feel that the world was large and moving. The cottage lights were on. Through the kitchen window she could see Marcus sitting at the table, and George somewhere at floor level, visible as a small moving shape beneath the table edge. The yellow light was warm against the gray of the late afternoon. It was the most ordinary sight in the world. It was, to her, the most beautiful one. She thought about what she would tell people, if she were the kind of person who told people things, about how to survive the moments when everything that was supposed to hold does not. She thought she would say, "You make the next decision from the clearest place you can find. You do not perform for anyone. You do not ask for permission to continue. You find the thing that is real and you hold on to it, and you take it with you when you go." She had done that. She had taken the one real thing, 3 small heartbeats in the dark, and she had gone, and she had built the rest around them. She was at the cottage door now. She could hear George's voice through it, not words, just sound, the particular music of a 2-year-old entirely absorbed in the fact of existing. She stood for a moment with her hand on the door and listened. Then she opened it and went inside, into the warmth and the noise and the life she had built, and that would go on after her in the form of 3 good men and their children and whatever came after that, all the way forward into a future she would never see and that would carry, without knowing it, the shape of the choices she had made in a kitchen in a cottage on the southern coast of England, on a morning when the world had just ended its first version, and she had decided, without ceremony or bitterness or hesitation, to begin the next. The door closed behind her. The sea was outside. It would always be outside. And inside there was everything that mattered, and she was home.